and it is my pleasure to be welcoming Professor David Manning to give the 22nd George Brown Lecture. So George Brown was an eminent British clay mineralogist and one of the founding members of the Clay Minerals Group of the Mineralogical Society, and this lecture is named after him. And this lecture is given annually by a recognized authority in their respective field of clay mineralogy, field of research into clay mineralogy. And I think we all agree that David Manning is without a doubt such an authority with his research into the understanding of mineralogy and how it controls soil fertility and sequesters carbon, which is obviously addressing global grand challenges such as food security and climate change. So just to give you a short review, as I understand it, of David's path towards where he is now. So David started his research career at the University of Manchester as a NERC Research Fellow after receiving his PhD from the University of Manchester and his BSc from the University of Durham. After some stints as a researcher and lecturer in Nancy, France, and at Newcastle University, he returned to Manchester, where he went through what we know as a typical path of a university academic, so lecturer, senior lecturer, reader, and finally professor. And then he became the professor of soil science at Newcastle University in 2000, where he has been ever since, and engaged in his groundbreaking research linking environmental geochemistry, mineralogy, and soil science. His work has also been recognized over the years, for example, with the Schlumberger Medal of the Mineralogical Society in 2004. And he was also the Mineralogical Society's Distinguished Lecturer in 2009 and 2010. And I am very much looking forward to this current lecture, again bestowed via the Clay Minerals Group, this time from the Mineralogical Society. And this particular lecture will then also be published as a review paper in Clay Minerals. So watch out for that publication coming up in a year or so. And yes, I'm very much looking forward to the explorations that David Manning will give on mineralogy, mineral stability in soils, and how this affects food security and how it can mitigate climate change. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Anka. I'll just sort out the screen.
Yes, sure.
And I think it should be there now.
It is.
Yes, good. So thank you very much indeed for your kind words, and particularly I'd like to thank the group for the invitation to speak to you today. I had a look at what was said about George Brown in the obituaries of the Clay Minerals, of Clay Mineralogy, in fact, the journal. And we know him as an eminent clay mineralogist. He's one of the giants on whose shoulders we stand. But what was particularly interesting was to see the way in which his pioneering work was carried out at what is now Rothamsted Research. And he joined a department of pedology that was established through the influence of Goldschmidt, the father of geochemistry. And I thought this was particularly apt and appropriate because, as you'll hear later on, there's some of the work that Goldschmidt did in the 1920s, which comes round again in this talk later on. I then had a look at the list of George Brown lecturers, and my words, there's some eminent clay mineralogists amongst them. One of the things which I took from this was the way in which they came from different fields, from people working on soils, in the oil industry, and with industrial minerals. And it caused me to reflect that this is a manifestation of the true mineral wealth that sustains life on Earth. Now, that is where I'd like to start, and to think about the pressure that's upon us all when we look at the way the population is growing. So around 2020, and indeed now, there are 8 billion people on the planet, and that population growth, shown by the solid curve here, really ties into the green revolution since the Second World War, with the development of nitrogen fertilizers in the red dashed line, shooting up like that. And of course, they are made from natural gas. So the scales are different here, but the rate of rise of natural gas production ties in directly to our ability to produce nitrogen fertilizers. This poses an immense challenge to the future when you think that we're supposed to be moving away from carbon-based energy sources. It does make you wonder where we're going to get our fertilizers from, and that's as a raw material, not as a fuel. So we need to come up with some innovative thoughts, and we need to think very carefully about how minerals are going to help us to carry on, because although the growing population does level off by the time we get to the end of the century, we're still going to have 3 billion more mouths to feed, and that's quite a challenge to say the least. So what I want to talk about today is some aspects of how I see minerals playing a role in this, and this is a bit of a snapshot and rather personal view because other people will see different roles, and indeed we've heard some very stimulating talks this morning. I'll talk a bit about the weathering of silicate minerals, about the novel sources of crop nutrients that these offer, how they can be involved in taking carbon out of the biosphere. And I want to also to show you how we know these processes actually happen, because that's actually quite a difficult thing to do. So looking back, Jeff Wilson was the 4th George Brown lecturer presenting on products, processes and rates of primary mineral weathering. And we're all familiar with the graphic in the bottom left, which shows the geological cycle with weathering at the top. Of course, there are different perspectives depending on which area of the geosciences you come from. And he recognized and summarized in the review paper that was published that it's the mineral dissolution rate that matters. And these are logarithmic values towards the bottom end of the table there, right-hand side of the table there. And you'll see there that they are extremely small numbers, moles per centimeter squared per second, ever so small numbers. And of course, that is something which underpins mineral weathering, that it is apparently a slow process. So let me just move on. When we look at this process empirically, we can see the Golditch series, which was articulated by Golditch in 1938, and that shows us the sequence, which you can see from empirical observation, amongst the mafic minerals. The most easily weathered is olivine, then going through to pyroxene, then amphibole, then biotite. And in the plagioclases, calcium plagioclase weathers more easily than sodium plagioclase, and then K feldspar, muscovite, and quartz end up being the most resistant. All very, very empirical. And then if you take the approach that Charles Curtis published in 1976 to come up with a standard way, a consistent way of writing weathering reactions for these minerals so that you can then look at the thermodynamics and look at the free energies of reaction for them, you can see that these map onto that empirical series precisely, with the most negative free energies of reaction for forsterite, then enstatite, tremolite, biotite, going through to K feldspar, muscovite, and quartz. In this case, all these reactions are written with quartz as a product, so there's no free energy change there. And then similarly with anorthite and albite. So we can see here that Golditch and the empirical mineral stability series is one which is matched by the thermodynamics, so it's kind of comforting. Now, when these minerals weather, then they are releasing cations to the soil solution, and we know what our mineral formulae are, so we know what they've got within them as dominant cations, and we know what they will release. I've included the release of silica here for olivine and pyroxene because, of course, they lack aluminium in their formulae. And where aluminium is available, then clay minerals will form. But of course, where aluminium is not available, then it will be more the oxides, residual oxides and oxyhydroxides that will form. And obviously, the details of the mineralogy of what forms depends on the climate. And so this is a sweeping generalization. But the important point about this is that plants need those cations, and plants also take up silicon. So although we don't normally regard silicon as a fertilizer, we do know that it's active in that biological system and that plants are taking it up. And that's something that helps us understand the way in which these minerals work in soil environments. So I want to start off by looking at potassium and silicon. And I want to consider these two together because they're both there in a plant. They both occur in the same silicate minerals, and yet their behavior is different from a geochemical point of view. We know that plants commonly carry about 1% of potassium, so it's a nutrient that's absolutely essential for crop growth, for plant growth. And with the silicon, we find that wheat and sugarcane both have about 1% of silicon within them. It's something which is supposed to be passively uptaken by the plant, but it does serve a function through the formation of phytoliths, which are crystalline materials, or amorphous silica, I should say, rather than crystalline silica, within a plant that helps to give resistance to pesticides, and of course is one of the reasons why teeth wear down amongst herbivorous animals. And rice with 10% silicon has the highest silicon contents, which is well known from the point of view of those who deal with rice husk ash and such things. The important thing about this, though, is that silicon can only come from silicate minerals, so there's nowhere else that it can come from. But with potassium, it can come from a wide range of sources. And the conventional potassium fertilizers are the salts in the top 3 rows here. Sylvite potassium chloride, confusingly expressed as 63% K2O equivalent, and similarly for carnallite, expressed as 17% K2O equivalent for a mixture of magnesium and potassium chloride. And then the new mineral polyhalite, new in the sense that it is the product of the mines in Yorkshire now, Bulby mine producing this and selling it at the moment, and the Woodsmith mine being built at huge expense near Whitby to be able to sell very large quantities of this. So those are the conventional sources that farmers would generally go for. And when we look at the potassium silicates, we can see K-feldspar as the commonest of these, so it's top of the list with about the same amount of potassium as carnallite. Leucite and nepheline, the feldspathoids, leucite having more, relatively speaking, of K2O, nepheline a bit less, of course, because it has sodium in it. And then the micas, such as muscovite, biotite, phlogopite, with around 10 or 11%. So we have quite a choice of silicate minerals. I'm going to focus on feldspars to begin with, because these are amongst the most common minerals in the continental crust for the K-feldspars. And of course, if we include the plagioclases, then we can take into account ocean crust as well. So we'll look at K-feldspar in particular, and we'll leave the potassium, the plagioclase feldspars on one side until we get to the carbon capture story. So K-feldspar then is the important possible source of potassium and silicon, and calcium for carbon capture as a source of calcium. Well, K-feldspar, as I said, contains about 17% K2O. And there's a big problem with this, and that is that it actually is very hard to get out of the mineral. It dissolves very slowly. So we want to have a think about that. Think about, well, what can those weathering reactions be that would liberate both potassium and silicon? And then at the back of the audience, usually there's someone who comes from a crop science background saying, but what about aluminium? Because aluminium is toxic to plants. And here we need to think about the way in which the solubilities of silicon and aluminium contrast, and in near neutral pHs, slightly acidic pHs, the pHs of most soils, the concentration of aluminium in solution is 100,000 times less than the corresponding concentration of silicon. So although it is potentially a problem, it isn't one that causes much concern at this stage in this particular discussion. But if your pH of your soil was particularly low or particularly high, then it might be more of a matter of concern. But for the moment, let's assume it isn't a concern. Let's press on and have a look at the implications of silicon. Now, when you look at feldspar dissolution experiments, and the rates that are measured in the lab are extraordinarily slow. And it's the rate that's a really important thing. So this graphic here shows over a period of a year, the 365 days, the right-hand point there. It compares from published dissolution rates, the amount of potassium in milliequivalents per gram released from feldspar, and then from nepheline, with the highest rates for the open symbols, which are the acid dissolution mechanism. And you can see that it makes an enormous difference that nepheline releases potassium much, much more quickly than feldspar. That's a really important point to take home, because when we look at these silicate minerals again, and we look at the weight percent of K, we might say, well, feldspar, potassium feldspar with 14% K2O as a typical figure. Leucite is a bit higher, but leucite's quite rare. Nepheline, maybe half that of the K-feldspar. Muscovite and biotite, 9, 10, 11% K2O, giving us 9 to 7 weight percent of K itself. The dissolution rates, though, are very, very different. And these, of course, in this column are the logs of those dissolution rates. So if we calculate the relative dissolution rate, saying that K feldspar has a relative dissolution rate of 1, and we can see lucite will dissolve 10,000 times more quickly, but nepheline 20 million times more quickly, which is truly remarkable. So it's this dissolution rate that matters. Nepheline might only have a small amount of potassium in its structure, but boy, can it deliver that potassium so much more quickly than K feldspar. And a consequence of this is that if we have a very simple model system where we take the lab determined dissolution rates and we have a 1 millimeter equivalent spherical diameter grain of K feldspar, it'll sit there in the soil for 1 million years, which is a long time. Now, we've done a lot of experiments. We grow a lot of leeks in the northeast of England, so I'm sure many of you know, and they're very good experimental plants to work with because you can measure them as they grow as young plants. You measure their wastes to see how they're putting on weight. You can measure the diameter of the leek and how quickly that changes during the growth of the leek, and it shows you results in just about the right time for a master's student project. So it's a very good one to work with. The thing about trials of these minerals is that you've got to be so careful to control for the mineralogy of the soil. And that's one of the things that most crop growth experiments fail to do. They pay little, if any, attention to the mineralogy of the soil. And you don't know where their potassium's coming from when they're looking at the potassium that goes into the minerals, because they haven't taken care to know that it is not already present in the soil. So in these experiments, we used a very, very pure silica sand, and we put in a bit of a peat compost to make sure there was some water holding capacity there. And we grew leeks, and those leeks then were measured. This is the change in average treatment, diameter for the treatment of potassium chloride as a positive control, flogopite as an intermediate, as one of the silicates we're testing, cyanite, which is 90% K feldspar as a rock at this, in this particular study, and then the negative controls of nothing added down here. And you can see that in 10 weeks, we're seeing the differences of the different treatments really showing up nicely. And here we're seeing flogopite at much higher application rate than you would use KCl, but flogopite certainly delivering potassium, or rather doing something which enables the leeks to grow as well as they were growing in the KCl. And cyanite as well, breaking away from the negative control with these dotted trajectories. So we can see that we can test quite quickly for the availability of K in these, but how do we know it's K? Sorry, before I get to how we know it's K in a minute, but we can see that the rate of increase in the diameter of these different treatments, no significant difference between KCl and flogopite, although the cyanide feldspar was lagging behind and indeed showed very little difference compared with the negative control. Now, how do we know it's potassium? We measure the potassium content of the leek itself, and you can measure that, and you can see here that the KCl and flogopite, we're seeing high levels that are not statistically different, and we get the same result for a very, very high application of the cyanide in terms of the amount of potassium that's been put in. So we are seeing here some evidence that the cyanide and the K feldspar can give potassium to that growing plant. And then when we measure the offtake, which is the amount of potassium taken out by the pot of those leeks, then we can see a very similar thing, but here flogopite really takes the prize for taking potassium out. And of course that flogopite is also delivering magnesium to the plant, so it's delivering more than one nutrient, which again is a complicating factor. So we can see that from a simple experiment like that feldspars are decomposing in the soil, but they don't seem to like to decompose so well in the laboratory. And what we've done to investigate that is have a look at some feldspar grains of different age. So taken K feldspar grains from soil in Aberdeen, in one of the old granite quarries that's now a park in the city, in the northern side of the city of Aberdeen. And then we know that's about 150 years old from the historical maps when the quarry stopped working 150 years ago, in that particular case. We've also got and sampled 10 years after the feldspar was put in the soil, the cuttings from the Eastgate borehole in County Durham, which went into the Weardale granite that hasn't seen light of day for 300 million years. Those cuttings from that granite are sitting there in soil, and rabbits have been digging them up, so it's very easy to get hold of them now. And then that's a sample from Pernambuco in Brazil, where we were doing some work on cyanites, and unfortunately we don't know the exposure time for that, but we do see interesting features within it. Looking at the surfaces with SEM and comparing with the consequences on feldspar for an abiotic experiment in the lab over 10 weeks, let's have a look at what these things look like. So in experiment, I think many people who worked with the experimental dissolution of silicates have seen pictures like this. At the start of an experiment, try as hard as you might, it's quite hard to get rid of all the fine grains that cover the surface. And then after 10 weeks or so, you can see that they've disappeared a little bit, but there's no major change to that surface. 10 weeks isn't very long. But then when you look at the Weardale granite fragments that have been in the soil for 10 years, yes, you do find grains which are poorly corroded, so they haven't seen a lot of damage. But then you find others like this, which are very, very heavily corroded, with filaments, presumably fungal filaments, lots of evidence of corrosion of that surface, and lots of biology associated with that corrosion. And then looking around, you see things like this. This is a testate amoeba. So it's the sort of thing nightmares are made of. It's a little protozoan that lives there and is eating whatever it can get its teeth into. And we find that again in the sample from Aberdeen, very, very heavily corroded surfaces with fungal filaments and other filaments, and then these testate amoeba showing up again. So they seem to crop up. If you're lucky on an SEM session, you'll find these things. And then for the one from Pernambuco in Brazil, then the Holy Grail, seeing dividing bacteria like this. So we know there's a community there. I don't have time to go into the microbial community, but it's just important, I think, at this stage to see that it's there and to see that biology is playing an important role in this. That the surfaces of the mineral are colonized by that community. And what I'd like to consider here is that we can think of this community as being, as a whole, more important than the sum of its individual parts, because these three different organizational groups will be working together in slightly different ways. So protozoa, they're quite important, I think, apart from the fact they're quite cute to look at. They're predators, they're eating bacterium, fungi, anything else that they can get their teeth into. The testate ones have silica shells, and so they demonstrate the mobility of silica in these soil solutions. And they're quite fierce. If you look at this one here, you can see its teeth. They're quite nasty things. Not the sort of thing I'd like to meet on a dark night, but certainly important to remind us that in that soil ecosystem is a micro-ecosystem, and the services that it's providing enable us to grow our crops just as important to mankind as the ecosystem services that we see on the surface of the soil. So if we move on, having sort of set the scene to showing how minerals react, to look at carbon capture. The thing which is an elephant in the room here is, of course, that all of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere, if you look at any of the carbon cycle graphics, is such that all of it would pass through the coupled plant soil system in just 6 years. So the no-brainer is that if we want to do something about atmospheric CO2, then we have to work in ways that enable us to manipulate the plant soil system. But that's biology, and biology is taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere and then it's putting it back into the atmosphere. So there's an equilibrium set up there, which means that we have to intercept that somehow to be able to change it. And that's where minerals come in, because what we can do through minerals and mineral reactions is we can put that carbon into an inorganic form, and that then takes us out of the biological cycle, and that then takes it out of the greenhouse. So that's the way this thinking goes in the next few slides. It's really gathering momentum. I'm delighted to see papers like this one coming out, which are emphasizing how important this process might be. And so this is something which is happening increasingly, but it has a very long history. It goes back to 1970s when the first carbon and oxygen stable isotope measurements were being made, and people were showing that pedogenic carbonates, those formed in soils, actually had the carbon go into them from the photosynthesis process. Others have worked on mine wastes, like Greg Dipple's team in UBC, and the people who've moved on from there, and similarly for us in the urban soils and the people who've moved on from Newcastle, having worked on urban soils. So let's spend a few minutes looking at pedogenic carbonates. These are the carbonate minerals that form in soils. They're usually calcite, and they can form high, extensive hard layers called calcretes. They're well known from the Western United States, where they've been mapped, pedicals, those bearing calcium carbonates, and pedalths, those which lack calcium carbonates. But on the right here, we see Yenne's classic diagram that shows that the more rainfall there is, the deeper these carbonates form. And in the UK, where sort of high levels of rainfall, 75 to 100 centimetres, we survey our soils down to 1 metre. Chances are that we'll never find them. And so we don't see them reported. You do see them in the soil science reports of soils in Scotland, but the minute that soil series has crossed the border into England, it's not reported, which is an interesting artifact. So what do they look like? On the left is a pedocal in Calgary, and on the right, pedaltha. Not a lot of interest in those until you get close to. And then you see things like this in the pedocal. You see pebbles within the soil, and it's got a little beard on it, which is the calcite. It's analogous to the formation of a stalactite in many ways. So to get these things to form, you need two things. You need calcium and you need carbonate. And you've got to be able to provide the two. And we can think of the role of plants in this through photosynthesis, taking CO2 from the atmosphere, pumping it into the soil through the root system, and the roots are exuding organic acids. The organic acids are a bit like the saliva in our mouths because they're helping to generate the minerals in solution that the plant needs to take up. But they're also there as a substrate on which the microbes will feast. And it doesn't matter what the microbial process is that's taking place in the soil, as long as it's aerobic, that you're going to end up with CO2 as the ultimate end product of that. So the CO2 in the soil atmosphere increases, it then partitions in part into the soil solution, you end up with carbonic acid in solution, and then you might react with calcium silicates to give you calcium carbonate and water. So it's a very simple chain. We end up making limestone in the soil. So how does it work? Photosynthesis then is the critical thing. And I think we'll look at that diagrammatically, and you can see here a summary of the soil process from a microbiological point of view: carbon inputs, microbes respiring, CO2 coming out, soil organic matter forming and decomposing, working its way through that cycle. But we can add to that the organic acid anions specifically that come from plant root activity. And we can then add in the inorganic geochemical and the mineralogical pathways of calcium carbonate forming. The key thing about this is the role played by the soil microbes, because they're the driving force to generating the input of CO2 that go into this geochemical process that precipitates calcium carbonate. So linking it to photosynthesis comes from the carbon oxygen isotopes, and these fractionators that go through the different processes, as I'm sure you all know. And in the simplest of simple generalizations, you see something like this in a standard plot of delta 18O against delta 13C. You see the soil carbonates forming an array like this. Those formed from C3 plants, more negative than those formed from C4 plants. They're the two dominant metabolic pathways in photosynthesis. So you can distinguish, if you look back at your soil carbonates, you can say when land was deforested and grasses took over. And this is something which was really exciting, has been done widely in the North American prairies. But we also find these carbonates in urban soils, and we do from time to time go out and dig pits, and this is Phil Renforth's PhD time, and out come bricks from holes like the one on the left, and on those bricks you see little carbonate mineral clusters there. So we're seeing pedogenic carbonates actually growing on bricks in something that was demolished maybe 20 years ago. That led us to look at the Scottish Newcastle brewery site here with St James's Park on the top of this picture, for those of you who like to hear a roar. And this site was owned by Newcastle City Council with Newcastle University and other partners. We've been able to do lots of things on it. And Carla Washbourne, from part of her PhD, took an array of samples, and then 18 months later went back and took the samples from the same array, but a subset, very, very precisely located, and she then measured the calcium carbonate content. The graph on the right here shows those samples that every single one of those gained calcium carbonate. It went down about 1 meter from the graph on the left, and then things settled down to some kind of background level So we know that the top meter of the soil here is actively taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The isotopes show that with this array, like that's in the ideal graph. But okay, 2 swallows don't necessarily make a summer, but at least 2 swallows showed the right sort of direction. With carbon-14 measurements, Philip Ascott did at Suak, we get the lower proportion of modern carbon for the sample closest to the origin and the greater proportion of modern carbon for the sample furthest from the origin. So 80% modern carbon is pretty convincing that that is a modern process. And how quickly did it form? Well, we can do the sums, multiply it up, and we actually reckon that the measured value here that Carla was able to derive from this was 85 tons of CO2 being removed per hectare annually, or 20 tons of carbon per hectare per year. These are enormous numbers because if you go out and plant trees, the typical value will be 3.5 tons of carbon per hectare per year for new woodlands as they're growing. So it's a really important process that we were able to measure. So the difficulty we face is indeed in knowing how these processes actually work. Because although I've said you can go out and measure the inorganic carbon from soil samples, it's actually really, really hard to measure the changes. And Carla went to great pains to measure those with samples collected in the most precise way using high resolution GPS to figure out where the sample locations were. But we've been to many sites subsequently and really struggled to find any measurable changes. It's not surprising though, is it, in reflection, because soil is an open system and that inorganic carbon will migrate downwards in solution and it also migrates particulates. And it's very rare to come across a soil system where you can measure something in the top meter and take a sample and take it away and compare over a period of time how carbon has changed in that top meter. So instead, I want to have a look at the evidence of wheat. And here I want to take advantage of the observation that wheat is taking silica from the soil, because that's taking silica from weathering silicate minerals. And I want to suggest here that we could use crop growth as a proxy to give us a weathering rate for the bulk soil made up of whatever minerals it happens to have within it. So when we look at wheat, and I'm grateful to Nick Fadgley for letting me show this photo from a tweet he put out, we see wheat grows roots down and down and down and down. This is about 90 centimeters depth of soil. So this goes to show, where do you take your sample if you want to measure the effect of that wheat on the soil? You've really got to be very careful about how you do that. But anyway, the point about that is wheat straw is produced at about 3.5 tons per hectare, and it takes about 4 months to grow, and it's got about 2.5% silica within it. So we can estimate the silica extraction rate. And then what I've done in the next couple of slides is to compare with the mineral dissolution rates and see how they compare. So here's taking the equivalent spherical diameter expressed as grain radius for a selection of minerals, quartz with the red using the neutral dissolution mechanism, and then field symbols, the acid dissolution mechanism, which is where it's protonated, the neutral one where it isn't, for plagioclase, a pyroxene, and for wollastonite being used because that's commonly used as a source of silica for crop growth in places where it is needed. That's what wheat takes, this horizontal dotted line. And the key point about that is that what wheat is taking from the soil greatly exceeds what quartz can deliver. It also exceeds what the neutral dissolution mechanisms can deliver for the pyroxene and for the plagioclase. But wollastonite and then the pyroxenes and wollastonite again in the acid dissolution mechanism will deliver enough silica for wheat to take from the soil. Then if we look at the dissolution rates of the clay minerals, and again working with equivalent spherical diameter here, we can see again, and this is going down to much smaller grain radius, of course, because we're dealing with clays. Even if we take quartz down to clay size, then we're getting insufficient silica out of it. And we're seeing again a separation, if you like, here. We've got the common soil clay minerals. So we've got illite, we've got kaolinite, we've got clinochlor, chlorite, and we've got smectite. Basically, they can deliver what wheat needs. Clay mineral reactions will yield enough silica to be able to enable a crop of wheat to take the silica it wants from the soil. But if we look at the neutral dissolution mechanism, then this doesn't really work quite so well. So the bottom line for this treatment is that even clay-sized quartz can't deliver the silica that a crop of wheat needs, but the clay minerals can, and that's an important point to take into account. So to pull all this together, I've shown rather quickly and rather a high-level overview that minerals are dynamic components of the system that is driven by biology, and this is something which I think is really important to take away. I don't think I'm preaching to the unconverted here. I'm sure you're all converted, and everyone here knows that minerals react and react on a human timescale. But it's very common that when you're talking to biologists and people from outside the discipline of mineralogy, then minerals can be regarded as the sort of things you see behind glass cases in museums, and they don't change, they don't do anything. But they're absolutely vital. And I think what I hope I've been able to show you here is that the way in which they weather, the mechanism of weathering and the rates of weathering are absolutely vital in this area of study, that is in looking at soil mineralogy, to give us the plant nutrients that we need, and also to offer mechanisms for the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. We can, from the back of the envelope calculations with wheat, show that the dissolution rates to be effective need to be greater than 10 to the minus 11 moles per meter squared per second. So we've talked about small numbers, but they're big enough. And those numbers are there, they're achieved by the plagioclases, particularly basic plagioclases, calcium-rich plagioclases, that is, by mafic silicate minerals, by nepheline, and by the clay minerals themselves. But importantly, it appears that quartz and clay feldspars are incapable of doing this. And so what we can infer from the slides I was showing earlier of the corroded clay feldspars is that if biology has enabled that corrosion to take place, then biology has enabled that bulk dissolution rate to go above this 10 to the minus 11 moles per meter squared per second value. And that is the scientific reasoning why some of these mineral products that are on the market actually work. So we have on the left here a volcanic rock dust, which you can put on your garden and people swear by it. And here, something produced by Silica. This product from Silica brings us back to Goldschmidt and the start of what the remarks I was making about Goldschmidt, because this is something which tracks back in terms of its family tree to the work that Goldschmidt did between the two world wars, looking for sources of potassium in Norway. And the problem with that is that Goldschmidt only published in Norwegian, so no one has ever read his papers in recent times, and he rarely gets cited. But that man had foresight in working with fertilizers, working with soils, getting Rothenstedt to set up the laboratory there, the pedology laboratory that eventually employed George Brown. And with that, I'd like to finish, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. What a lovely round tour from the early 20s to the early 20s. And thanks also for keeping on time. So we do have a few minutes for questions for David, if anyone wants to. Yes, John.
Hi there, David. Thank you very much. A really, really interesting talk. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on adding anthropogenic materials to soil, anthropogenic, maybe industrial byproducts, slags, concrete, demolition waste, those kinds of things as possible way for enhancing particularly the CO2 angle of capture, angle of what you were talking about there.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and you're absolutely right that these do play that role. So in the Science Central example, where we're getting 85 tons of CO2 removed per hectare annually, that is entirely because it was crushed concrete that was in the site. And so that's absolutely what you would expect because of the mineralogy being involving calcium hydroxide and unstable calcium silicate minerals that are artificial. And the same goes for steel slags and things like that. So you know, there is definitely a role to play there. The thing that's always on my mind about that is that although it's an essential thing to do to help close the loop on the carbon cycle for those minerals, for those materials, then you're not taking out new CO2, because all you're taking out is the CO2 that was lost when the limestone that was used to make those things was calcined. And so from that point of view, the perhaps more interesting thing to do is to look at silicate minerals of geological origin, where there's no burden of carbon costs in their manufacture, or a very low burden in the processing that we might do.
Thanks a lot. Any further questions? Yes, Steve.
Hi, David. That was a fantastic talk. Thank you very much. I had a question about your leaks. Being Welsh, I was obviously going to come up with that one. But you showed the cyanide giving potassium to the plants, but then you concluded at the end that feldspars, weren't very effective. So what is it about? Are some feldspars more effective than others? I asked the question as well because there's I got about 10-15 years ago, I got handed a very interesting set of documents from work done here at the Macaulay Institute. I think even before Jeff Wilson's time. I can't remember exactly who gave it to me, and it was a study of the Adularia rock from northeast Scotland, and somebody been trying to apply it as a fertilizer. And basically, people at the Macaulay did a whole series of tests and found it had no effect whatsoever. But there was some political kind of intervention, because I think there was a very wealthy landowner that was trying to sort of push it as a fertilizer, and they actually tried to get the Macaulay to falsify results. It was quite extraordinary, really. It would make an interesting film. So I just wondered what it was with that particular cyanide.
It's really interesting. As an area show, yes, I've come across those stories as well. Yes, so that's a feldspar-based rock, for those who've not come across that before. I think the thing is about that is I'm being a bit pessimistic and pulling my punches on the feldspar story, because it really is very hard to demonstrate that feldspar unambiguously is a source of the potassium. And so it does take that kind of very careful experiment where there's no other source of potassium. But then you look at the application rate. I mean, it was 43 grams, 43 times as much as the KCl. It's really enormous in that particular example. So you're really growing it basically in nothing but feldspar almost. So I think it was exaggerating the ability of feldspar there. But I think what really interests me is the corrosion that we saw, because there are locations around the country where you can find soils of known age with feldspar crystals within the soil, and then have a look at them and look at the biological community. And you're looking at a fractal landscape. It's like looking down at a city full of skyscrapers where you're seeing where all these bugs live. And you don't tend to see that fractal landscape on the surface of a grain that's been reacted in a lab without any biological inputs.
Okay, thank you.
We have a question in the chat, so I'm just going to read it for you before we go to Binoy. We can ask the last question before we have to move on. So what is the role of organic acids in silica dissolution, and how would that enhance the weathering rates?
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. These organic acids are multidentate ligands that help with the complexing, and one of the ways in which they're interacting with aluminium, for example, is to complex aluminium so its toxicity is reduced, so it isn't taken up by the plant. So that is a very quick answer to that. It is a very, very long-standing question that you have asked, and it's indeed how I got involved in looking at feldspar dissolution, was looking at the role of organic acids in feldspar dissolution in diagenesis in plastic reservoirs. So I'll not give a long answer now, but it is an area where there's a huge amount of work gone into looking at the complexing capabilities of some of these organic acid ligands. Binoy has a question.
Binoy, please.
Yeah, thanks, Anke. Many congratulations, David, and for this fantastic talk, very comprehensive and really enlightening to the deep of the science. Now, my question is regarding the desilication and exploitation of potassium from soil. And we see that tropical areas of the world, there we have this issue, loss of desilication and potassium exhaustion of the soil. Now, some group of researchers, they are saying this, application of this enhanced weathering concept and application of rock, this can be scaled up across the world, everywhere in the world. But at the same time, we have seen that carbonate minerals are forming in the soil. And that is a problem in the semi-arid area already, this excess carbonate and the alkalization of soil. So how you see, like how much you agree or disagree with the concept that this new technology can be scaled up across the tropics?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and these reactions take place far more quickly in tropical soils where silicates are inherently unstable. So the point to remember is that from the point of view of fertility, the amount of rock that's needed is actually quite low. So if you're applying 20 tons per hectare, it's impossible to measure that addition of rock to a soil, to take a sample and to put it through an analytical method that's sensitive enough to detect that. So you're never really adding a huge amount, but you're certainly adding enough for plants to take up for their crop nutritional needs. There's a lot of work being done in Brazil, which relates to this through the Rush-Argem movement, the mineralization movement there, where they're gaining experience in this with rock dust. So it's something which is being shown to work without the problems that you're describing.
Thank you very much. Maybe one very, very short last question, David. So how far do you think we are from practical large-scale application to capture CO2? And are there any particular regulatory hurdles?
Yes, thanks to you for that question. We're much closer than we might think, because the industry that produces these rocks is in existence with planning permissions that extend to the 2040s. So automatically you can tick the first box in the process, which is how do you get planning permission to produce these rocks? And in the UK, that's already been ticked. The industry is set up to deliver. From the point of view of the regulatory side of things, then these rocks are being sold already and have a long history of use in agriculture with licenses from the Soil Association and other organic accrediting bodies, which reflects due diligence on the part of manufacturers. So I think some of the regulatory issues can be dealt with, although one might want to cross-check the way in which the Soil Association licenses a material to the way in which the Environment Agency would look at it's being used. But they've got a long history of use, and there's quite an extensive practice, although it isn't terribly common yet.
Thanks very much for answering all of these very diverse questions, and thank you once again for giving this lecture. We're very much looking forward to reading your review once it's ready. You're not going to get off the hook for that.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.